On the morning of the 8th of May, 1942, two large American warships were standing watch over a stretch of ocean northeast of Australia. The sailors aboard these ships had been trained for years for this moment, but none of them really knew what to expect. For the first time in naval history, opposing warships would fight each other without ever seeing each other. Their battle would be fought entirely by aircraft, across distances of more than 100 miles, over an ocean they couldn't see across. By the end of the day, one of America's most famous warships would be at the bottom of the Coral Sea, and 2,735 of her crew would be swimming in the ocean, waiting to be rescued. But before that, one young sailor would break into a supply room during the evacuation, load his helmet with ice cream, and hand it up to his friends standing on the flight deck of a sinking ship. This is the story of USS Lexington, the Lady Lex, and the first carrier battle in history. The Lady Lex. A ship's history. The USS Lexington, CV-2, was one of the U.S. Navy's first true aircraft carriers. She was commissioned in 1928, a ship born in the age of aviation, converted from battlecruiser plans to fulfill a new role in naval warfare that nobody was entirely sure about yet. For over a decade before World War II, the Lexington and her sister ship, Saratoga, served as the Navy's floating laboratories for aircraft carrier warfare. Officers and pilots learned how to launch aircraft from a moving ship. They learned how to recover planes in rough seas. They practiced coordinated strikes. In annual exercises, they even staged surprise air attacks on Pearl Harbor, Hawaii attacks that proved prescient when the Japanese would do for real what American pilots had only practiced in war games. When the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the Lexington wasn't there. She was out at sea, ferry aircraft to Midway Island. She escaped the devastating surprise attack that crippled so much of the Pacific Fleet. When she returned to Pearl Harbor on December 13, the damage shocked everyone aboard. The harbor was a graveyard of ships, but the Lexington had been spared. For the next 4 months, the Lexington and her air group participated in raids across the Pacific. They attacked Japanese positions in the Marshall Islands. They conducted operations off New Guinea. They were earning their place as part of the Navy's new strategy, using aircraft at sea, rather than battleships, as the capital weapon of naval warfare. By May 1942, American intelligence officers had broken the Japanese naval code. They knew the Japanese were planning Operation Mo, a major assault to seize Port Moresby in New Guinea. If Port Moresby fell to Japan, Australia and New Zealand would be cut off from their allies. The war in the Pacific could turn catastrophic. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, commander of the Pacific Fleet, made a decision. He would send 2 American aircraft carriers, the Lexington and the Yorktown, to the Coral Sea to stop the Japanese invasion. The first carrier battle, May 7 and 8, 1942. On the 3rd of May, 1942, Japanese forces landed on Tulagi in the Solomon Islands without opposition. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, commanding the American task force in the Coral Sea, received intelligence of the landing and immediately ordered his aircraft to attack. This was the first indication to the Japanese that American carriers were in the area. For the next few days, both the American and Japanese forces maneuvered in the Coral Sea, searching for each other. The ocean is vast. Radar in 1942 was unreliable and short-ranged. Finding an enemy carrier, a ship that's roughly 900 feet long but spread across the ocean like a moving airfield, was like finding a needle in a haystack, except the needle was also trying to find you. On May 7, both sides finally located targets, but not each other's carriers. The Japanese found and sank the American destroyer USS Sims and badly damaged the fleet oiler USS Neosho. At the same time, American aircraft found the Japanese light carrier Shoho. In a coordinated attack, American dive bombers and torpedo bombers overwhelmed the small Japanese carrier. The pilot who reported the kill sent a message that would become legendary. Scratch one flat top. The Shoho sank with tremendous loss of life. Of her 834-man crew, only 203 were rescued. But the major Japanese and American fleet carriers, the Shokaku, Zuikaku, Lexington, and Yorktown, were still searching for each other. On the morning of May 8, both sides finally found what they were looking for. American search planes spotted the Japanese carriers. Japanese planes spotted the American carriers. Both sides scrambled their aircraft. Captain Frederick C. Ted Sherman, commanding the Lexington, ordered general quarters at 0552 hours. The crew raced to their battle stations. At 0900 hours, both sides' aircraft were launching. By mid-morning, Japanese aircraft were approaching the Lexington. The attack. Death comes to Lady Lex. Jim Finney was on the flight deck of the Lexington that morning, checking electrical systems in the aircraft. He caught sight of a plane flying off the port side of the ship. Something dropped from it. Jim's first thought was that something had fallen off a plane and that somebody has sure messed up. It was actually a Japanese torpedo plane dropping the first torpedo to hit the Lexington. At 1120 hours, 2 Japanese torpedoes struck the port side of the Lexington almost simultaneously. The explosions were tremendous. The ship shook from the impacts. Seconds later, 2 Japanese bombs hit the ship. The explosions, the fires, the smoke, the entire ship seemed to shudder. Harry Frey was standing on a landing near the emergency battery locker when the first torpedo hit. He watched as the Japanese attack continued. Aircraft were trying to land on the ship. Other aircraft were trying to take off. Some planes that had already landed were being shoved over the side to make room for other aircraft. Other planes were being directed to land on the USS Yorktown instead. The damage to the Lexington was severe. Hydraulic systems were jammed. Boiler rooms were flooding. But the most critical damage was to the aircraft fuel storage tanks on the port side. Aviation gasoline, highly flammable, was spilling throughout the ship. Fires started and spread. For hours, the crew fought the fires. Damage control parties worked frantically to control the flooding, to isolate the fires, to save the ship. Captain Sherman and his crew refused to give up on the Lexington. She had served the Navy for 14 years. She had trained aviators and sailors. She had seen action across the Pacific. But by 1700 hours, 5 o'clock in the afternoon, it became clear that the ship was lost. Captain Sherman issued the order. Abandon ship. The evacuation. Ice cream on a sinking ship. The crew of the Lexington numbered about 2,950 men. When the abandoned ship order was given, they had to evacuate in an organized manner. There wasn't time for chaos. There wasn't room in the rescue vessels for everyone all at once. So the evacuation proceeded by groups. Each group had a period of time to wait before it was their turn to leave the ship. Jim Finney's group was waiting. So was Harry Frey's group. And while they waited, surrounded by smoke and the sounds of explosions, some of the sailors remembered something. The Gedunk. The Gedunk was what sailors called the ship's service store soda fountain. It was located below the flight deck, near the aft elevator, and it was stocked with ice cream, something precious, something almost unimaginable in the midst of battle. Harry Frey later recounted what happened. So, I rolled off the flight deck, onto the next level. There was a big lock on the hatch going into the Gedunk. Now there was a fire axe there, so I took the axe, and it took only one blow to knock off the lock. I went in and took my helmet off, and I went behind the counter and loaded my helmet with pineapple ice cream. Then I went out and I tossed it up to my buddy on the flight deck. Other sailors got the same idea. Word spread. By the time the groups were mustered to evacuate, sailors were standing on the flight deck of the sinking USS Lexington, in the midst of a battle, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, eating pineapple ice cream from their helmets. It's a moment of surreal humanity in the midst of catastrophe. The horror of war, interrupted by something as simple and innocent as ice cream. These young men, many of them teenagers or barely adults, faced with the reality of their ship dying beneath them, found a way to grab a moment of ordinary pleasure before they had to face the ocean. Jim Finney's group took the emergency life rafts out of the remaining aircraft. 36 aircraft would be lost with the ship, inflated them, and threw them overboard. Then they climbed down rope lines from the flight deck about 5 feet down into the water. The ship was sinking. The ocean was filled with debris, oil, and fuel. The smell was overwhelming. But Navy ships were there, destroyers and cruisers that had been escorting the Lexington. The USS Haman picked up Jim's group. The USS Morris picked up Harry Frey. Other destroyers and cruisers rescued other sailors. By 1830 hours, 2,735 men had been pulled from the water. 216 men had been killed in the attack and subsequent explosions. The end of a legend. Captain Sherman was the last man to leave the Lexington. He had stayed aboard to make sure his crew was safe. Only when he was certain that no other sailors remained did he leave the ship. He even managed to rescue Admiral Wags, the captain's Cocker Spaniel, which had its own muster station under the captain's bed during the evacuation. But the Lexington wasn't abandoned just to be salvaged later. The U.S. Navy couldn't allow a ship of that size, with all its technical secrets, to fall into Japanese hands. The destroyer USS Phelps was ordered to sink the Lexington. At 1,841 hours, the Phelps fired torpedoes into the dying carrier. The hull was glowing cherry red from the fires burning inside. The ship took about an hour to sink completely. The Lexington, the Lady Lex, the ship that had served the Navy since 1928, finally disappeared beneath the waves of the Coral Sea. The survivors' lives after battle. Jim Finney, after being rescued by the Haman, was later transferred to the cruiser USS Portland from Tonga. A troop ship took him back to San Diego. His next assignment would be the aircraft carrier USS Enterprise. After various shore assignments, Jim was in Houston when he heard that World War II had ended. After his discharge, Jim used the GI Bill to further his education. He rejoined the Navy and eventually retired as a warrant officer with over 20 years of service. He lived until September 2015. Harry Frey, after being rescued by the USS Morris, was transferred to the cruiser USS Chester and taken to Tonga and then to San Diego. He was assigned to the escort carrier USS Card, which protected convoys in the Atlantic and searched for German submarines. Later, he served on the aircraft carrier USS Bennington. After the war, Harry used the GI Bill to earn a degree from Trinity University in San Antonio, where he was from, and a master's degree from Oklahoma. He eventually passed away on the 22nd of August 2016. But his connection to the Lexington didn't end with the war. On the 15th of July 2017, his ashes and those of his wife were buried at sea from the nuclear aircraft carrier USS Ronald Reagan with a 21-gun salute at the exact location in the Coral Sea where the USS Lexington sank in 1942. The Patton brothers, a family service. Among the survivors of the USS Lexington were 7 brothers named Patton from Iowa. All of them had been assigned to the Lexington after surviving the attack on Pearl Harbor. The USS Nevada, the battleship they'd been on, had been badly damaged in the Japanese attack on the 7th of December 1941, but the 7 brothers had all survived. After the Lexington sank, the Patton brothers were reassigned to different ships, a deliberate Navy policy to prevent the tragedy that had struck another famous family. The 5 Sullivan brothers had all died together when their ship, the USS Juneau, was sunk during the Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942. To prevent that from happening again, the Navy made sure that close family members were assigned to different vessels. The youngest Patton brother, Wayne, had been too young to serve initially. The family had a nickname for him, Patton Pending, waiting until he was old enough to join the Navy. All 8 of the Patton brothers returned home when World War II ended. Admiral Wags, the dog who survived. Captain Sherman's dog, Admiral Wags, was a Cocker Spaniel who apparently had his own muster station aboard the Lexington under the captain's bed. When the order to abandon ship was given, Captain Sherman made sure to rescue the dog. Wags was evacuated on one ship and Sherman on another, but they were eventually reunited at Tonga. Fanny Jessup Sherman, the captain's wife, was so moved by the dog's story that she wrote a children's book about Admiral Wags, published in 1943. The dog lived to be 17 years old and was eventually buried in the Sherman's backyard with full military honors in 1949. Strategic significance. A turning point. From a tactical perspective, the Battle of the Coral Sea was a Japanese victory. The Japanese sank the Lexington, while the Americans only sank the light carrier Shoho and damaged the Shokaku. The Japanese lost fewer ships overall, but from a strategic perspective, it was an American victory. The Japanese invasion of Port Moresby never took place. Australia and New Zealand remained connected to their allies. More importantly, the damage to the Shokaku was so severe that the ship couldn't participate in the Battle of Midway, which would be fought less than a month later. The loss of pilots and aircraft also meant that the Zuikaku couldn't be fully crewed for Midway. The absence of these two carriers at Midway would prove catastrophic for Japan. Midway would be the turning point of the Pacific War, and it might never have gone the way it did without the loss of the Lexington at the Coral Sea. The USS Lexington was never replaced. There was no USS Lexington CV-2, salvage, or recovery. But the Navy decided to name a new carrier being built in Massachusetts after the legendary ship. The new USS Lexington, CV-16, was commissioned on the 17th of February, 1943. She became known as the Blue Ghost because Japanese pilots thought they were sighting the same ship multiple times, confused about how it was possible that the Lexington could have survived when they were certain they'd sunk her at the Coral Sea. The Lexington's wreck rested on the floor of the Coral Sea for 76 years. On the 4th of March 2018, an expedition led by Microsoft co-founder Paul Allen's research vessel, Petrel, discovered the wreckage of the USS Lexington at a depth of about 2 miles. The ship had been found, largely intact, on the ocean floor. The discovery brought closure to a legendary ship's story. Today, the USS Lexington, CV-16, the Blue Ghost, is a museum ship in Corpus Christi, Texas. Thousands of visitors walk her decks every year, standing on the same flight deck where young sailors once stood with ice cream in their helmets, waiting to evacuate a sinking ship during the first carrier battle in history. The Battle of the Coral Sea was a transition point in naval warfare. It marked the end of the age of battleships as the capital ship of the Navy and the beginning of the age of aircraft carriers. No battleships participated in this battle. No naval guns were fired at enemy targets. Two navies, separated by over 100 miles of ocean, fought each other entirely through the air. The sailors and officers aboard the Lexington didn't know, as they went to battle that morning, that they were making history. They just knew they had a job to do. Captain Sherman knew how to command a ship. Jim Finney knew how to maintain electrical systems. Harry Frey knew how to keep statistics on aircraft. The Patton brothers knew their duties. What they produced, through their training and their courage and their sacrifice, was a victory that changed the course of the Pacific War. The loss of the Lexington was a tragedy. 216 men died in the attack and explosions. But the preservation of Port Moresby, the crippling of Japanese carriers that should have been at Midway, the lessons learned about aircraft carrier warfare, these were the legacy of their sacrifice. And somewhere in that legacy is a moment frozen in time of young men facing danger and death, breaking into a supply room and loading their helmets with pineapple ice cream. It's a moment of humanity in war. A moment of life asserting itself against death. A moment when, even as their ship was dying beneath them, these young sailors reached for something ordinary and beautiful. That moment is the true spirit of the Lexington and her crew. Not just warriors, but human beings, trying to hold on to their humanity even as history was being made around them.